1920s were a time of rebirth, jazz, dance, feminism, and much more. They were also a time for much darker topics, such as murder. University of Chicago students Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb are some of the most well-known murderers of the Roaring Twenties. Leopold was the son of the millionaire president of the Fiber Can Company, and Loeb was the son of the vice president of Sears. Their childhoods involved excessive fantasizing, reading of detective fiction, drinking alcohol at an early age, associating with people much older than themselves, and in the case of Leopold, sexual abuse by a governess and the death of his mother when he was 14.
The Boys Criminal Association began around 1920. They participated in vandalism, set fires, set off false fire alarms, and other petty crimes. They became increasingly obsessed with the development of perfect crime.
They began planning the perfect crime in November of 1923 and decided to kidnap and kill 14-year-old Bobby Franks, a distant cousin of Loeb. They debated kidnapping the grandson of William Deutsch, the president of Sears, but decided Franks was the perfect subject because he was small and more reserved and quiet.
On May 21st, 1924, Leopold and Loeb set out to kidnap and kill Bobby Franks. They rented a car using a fake name and ID and drove to Franks' school and to wait for him to come out. They convinced him to join them in the car as Loeb drove. Leopold strangled Frank. The boys dumped the body into a swamp south of the city and returned home.
Leopold and Loeb tried to make the murder look like a kidnapping, but before they could follow through on the kidnapping plot, Frank's body was discovered. The boys tried helping two of their friends, who were journalists, try and track down the killer. Little did the journalists know the killers were right under their noses.
The case broke when Leopold's glasses were found at the scene, and lawyer Clarence Darrow took the case.
This case was one of the first times many psychological theories were introduced in a court of law. When interviewed, the boys described that their sacrificial selves had willed them to commit the crime. Also, Darrow argued that the boys had developed abnormally due to their childhoods and should not be sentenced to life in prison. Despite Darrow's argument, the judge sentenced both to life in prison.
Loeb was murdered in 1931 while in prison, and Leopold was let out on parole in 1957 and died of natural causes in 1971. Ruth Snyder, a housewife from Queens, had an affair with Judd Gray to avoid her unhappy marriage with Albert Snyder. Ruth's distaste for Albert began when he insisted on hanging a picture of his dead fiancée, Jessie Gushard, up in their house. He once described Jessie as the finest woman he had ever met. Clearly, he was not too invested in Ruth.
Snyder raided her lover, Judd Gray, to help kill her husband. They had been trying to find ways to get Ruth out of her marriage. She tried killing Albert with 7 different unsuccessful attempts. Prior to the murder, Ruth tricked Albert into signing a double indemnity policy on his own life. Ruth and Judd's plan was to stage Albert's death as a robbery gone bad and collect the insurance payout for $48,000, $500,000 in today's money.
In the early morning on March 20th, 1927, Ruth and Judd smashed Albert with a sash weight, strangled him with picture wire, and stuffed a chloroform-soaked cloth in his nose, all while Ruth's 9-year-old daughter slept across the hall.
After killing Albert, Ruth and Judd ransacked the house to make it look like a burglary. Judd even tied up Ruth and left her in the hallway where she claimed to have been attacked by 2 giant Italians.
The cover-up was sloppy, and the police suspected Ruth from the beginning. They found jewelry Ruth said had been stolen, stuffed in her mattress, and Ruth didn't look like she'd been knocked out, although she claimed to have been knocked unconscious. Ruth confessed quickly after her arrest, but then recanted and laid the blame on Judd. Judd admitted his part in the crime entirely, but made Ruth out to be the mastermind.
The case immediately made front-page news across the country, with 1,500 people attending the trial and 2,000 more mobbing the streets because it was unbelievable that a housewife had done such terrible things to her husband.
A young Chicago Tribune reporter named Tom Howard was assigned to cover Ruth's execution. He rigged a homemade camera to his leg that would capture a picture when a wire was pulled. He miraculously snapped a picture on January 12th when Ruth Snyder was electrocuted at the age of 32.
Snyder's execution photo was made famous overnight and was on the front page of every newspaper in the nation. It was, and arguably will remain, the most famous tabloid picture of all time.
On the same day, Judd Gray also died in the electric chair, a not-so-fairy-tale ending to 2 once inseparable lovers. In 1870, Albert Fish was born to an extremely unusual family in Washington, D.C. His father, Randall, was 75 years old, while his mother was only 32, and they had many mental illnesses. Albert had 3 older siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin, and spent much of his childhood in orphanages.
His father died from a heart attack, and Albert was put in an orphanage. There he was beaten, and he started to enjoy the physical pain that was brought after. His mother was able to remove him from the orphanage, and he got a job as a telegraph boy.
His first boyfriend introduced him to urolagnia, which is drinking urine, and prophagia, which is eating feces. Fish also spent a lot of his time visiting the public bathrooms and watched boys undress. In his early adulthood, Albert married a young woman named Anna Mary Hoffman and had 6 children. Their names were Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. Fish's first attack was on a child named Thomas Bedden in Wilmington, Delaware. Then he stabbed a mentally retarded boy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. He tried to lure 8-year-old Beatrice Keel off of her parents' farm with money to help him get rhubarb from the neighboring fields. Her mother saw him and chased him away.
When Albert Fish was 58, he visited Grace Budd's home for business, and while there, he decided to eat Grace. He convinced her to let her parents let her go with him to his sister's house for a party. They left and never came back. Albert directed Grace to an abandoned house and told her to wait outside. He went upstairs and undressed so blood wouldn't get on his clothes, and called her up. When she saw him, she screamed and attempted to run away. He grabbed her and choked her to death, and cut her up and ate her.
7 years later, he wrote a letter to Mr. and Mrs. Budd describing what he did to Grace and what made him do it. The investigation of Grace Budd lasted 6 years until investigators traced the letter Albert wrote to the Budds. It led to a flat house Fish was living in, and he was immediately arrested and confessed to killing Grace and other children. Fish wrote letters to many of his victims' families, and the following is a clip from one letter he wrote to a boy's family.
I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the boy there, stripped him naked, and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a dirty piece of rag.
The trial of Albert Fish brought out the horrendous and pedophiling truth of what he did to those innocent children.
As he was explaining the details about killing the children, he was smiling, and the detectives thought of him as the devil himself.
Fish pleaded innocent due to the reason of insanity. He stated the voices in his head told him to kill the children and do other horrendous crimes. Multiple psychiatrists found Fish insane, but the jury found him sane and guilty after a 10-day trial. He was sentenced to death by the electric chair.
Fish was electrocuted in the Sing Sing prison on January 16, 1936. It took him only 2 jolts to die. The rumor was that the technical equipment short-circuited by the 26 needles he injected into his pelvis area. Bonnie and Clyde were young adults when they met in Texas during the Great Depression, each struggling to survive on their own. They joined together in a life of crime, trying to create a better life for themselves. Clyde Barrow was born to a very poor family. His first incident with the law was when he rented a car and didn't return it. He was 17 at the time and was arrested. Then he began to steal cars and rob stores with his brother until he was sent to East Ham Prison Farm. Bonnie Parker met Clyde as a waitress, but at the time was already married to Roy Thornton. She fell in love with Clyde and decided to wait for him to get out of prison. They were married as soon as he was released, even though she and Roy weren't officially divorced. Clyde became an official murderer when he killed his cellmate Ed Crowder in retaliation for a brutal assault. When he was released from jail, he formed the Barrow Gang, as he'd already met Bonnie.
At first, Bonnie and Clyde seemed like heroes to people because they were robbing banks and fighting poverty. But that changed when they began to kill people. They killed 9 police officers during a bank robbery, and people began to realize they weren't Robin Hoods.
Clyde's brother, Buck Barrows, joined the gang. He and his wife, Blanche, were pardoned from jail, so they immediately hooked up.
The 2 couples were living together in Missouri when they became known across the U.S. Their house was ambushed and surrounded by 2 policemen. They escaped, but 2 policemen were killed in a gunfight. Police found photos of Bonnie and Clyde in the house, and they were in newspapers all around the U.S. the next day.
They sprung Henry Methvin from a Texas prison and worked together for a few months before leaving Methvin behind at a restaurant while getting food for the gang. Clyde got spooked by a police car and drove away.
Before Methvin got left behind, they had already come up with a secret meeting plan in case this happened. He hitchhiked to his parents' home in Louisiana, where he made the mistake of telling his father about the rendezvous point, and his father tipped off the authorities. The next morning, there was a whole posse of police officers hidden at the meeting point, and when Bonnie and Clyde rolled in, bam! All the policemen jumped out and shot them. More than 150 bullets hit the car, killing Bonnie and Clyde almost instantly. Here is a reenactment of Bonnie and Clyde's death.
Get him, fellas. He reaches for it, let him have it. Look out! Death is at the steering wheel.
Even though the 2 lovers died, their legacy still lived on. By the time of their deaths in 1934, Bonnie and Clyde were blamed for the deaths of at least 12 people. As Bonnie once predicted, they would be written into American history books. Many people wonder if they deserved all their fame, but they have to agree that they added some excitement into the Great Depression era. The 1920s were not as frilly and fun as much of the media believed they were.